Good evening. Dr Marek Laskiewicz of the Polana Universitetas in Exteris. My lecture tonight is entitled World War III and Ukraine. Synopsis. UK, USA, Ukraine, Poland and Russia will soon be, perhaps, at war. At present we are in a confrontation which may become a clash, whereupon the route via conflict, intensification, expansion, tactical nukes leading to the thermonuclear exchange will have begun. This is the predicted escalation route for World War III in Ukraine crisis, or for that matter, any other future crisis. Mad, mutually assured destruction is therefore the route to World War III, which is likely to occur eventually. Each step to world termination will, though, appear rational and correct. Main lecture. As predicted in my book, Russia and World War III, and republished as Russia, World War III, the initial prediction stated in 1992 that Ukraine will most likely become the flashpoint for a war between the West and Russia. As also predicted there, the West will eventually be confronting a revanchist Russia led by a dictator who did eventually arise in 1999, President Vladimir Putin. As also predicted in my book 2001 World War III, republished 2015, the course the war will follow is that of mutually assured destruction. The world will therefore follow a route which was set up as a way of avoiding World War III, but ironically, instead of saving the world, it provides an escalation route to a strategic thermonuclear exchange as the culmination of World War III. Thus, the predicted route is as follows. Confrontation, as is occurring right now on the Ukrainian and Russian frontier. No shots are exchanged, however, two armies are in close proximity, which is in itself a mega crisis. What will happen then, quite possibly, is a clash. When the clash comes, this is the start of the war. However, the clash may occur not by means of military action, such as an invasion by Russia, which is what is being predicted widely, but instead it may be by other sorts of military action, including by terrorists or by commandos. It may occur through simply political action, such as separatists inviting in Russian forces, or civil unrest in Ukraine, or whatever else. It may occur through error. This is one of the problems with technological systems, that if they do give an error, including overreacting, which has happened, then the net effect is suddenly you can find yourself in a confrontation where none need exists. Obvious examples of this are how stock market crashes are exaggerated by the fact that computers have algorithms causing them to sell massively, whereas had it been by human investors only, quite possibly such an overreaction may not have occurred. Another one is loss of face. There is a problem, and this is one of the problems in the current crisis, is that the West is leaving President Putin ever less room for maneuver by virtue of lecturing him and warning him, so that, in effect, were he to back down, it would be very dangerous for him, and therefore he may choose to go through an invasion as a way of retaining prestige and power, and quite possibly his life. There's also, it may be simply misinterpretation. Actions by one side can be misinterpreted by the other. What is ostensibly a defensive action may be seen as an aggressive action by the other side. In a sense, this is how Russia is presenting its military maneuvers as a defensive action, but of course many on the West see this as an aggressive action, and vice versa for Ukrainian or Western troops on the frontier near the Russian forces. Having then had the clash, Then comes the conflict, which presumably be local and also small scale. This will be no more than, say, an invasion of the Donetsk basin by the Russian forces to secure a second territorial expansion, just as Crimea, in fact Crimea being the first, this time more bloody of course than the Crimean one was, but nevertheless it would be perhaps would suffice such a local conflict. At any stage, therefore, it is possible the war may stop. Were Russia to seize the Donetsk basin, perhaps that would suffice. However, it is more than likely, because wars follow logic of their own, that the war would in fact spread, and that therefore it would become a conventional war engulfing the whole of the Ukraine. It would, of course, by that time quite possibly have spread, but in the sense that the Ukraine remained the primary area. However, Belarus might well, by means of its president, invite in Russian forces, and the Baltic states are, of course, scarcely able to defend themselves. So it's quite possible by that time, given that it's no longer a question of occupying land held by Russians in eastern Ukraine, it would by that time be conquering the previous USSR. It's quite possible that, of course, other countries will go. The key ones are, however, Belarus, Lithuania, and the rest of Ukraine. In a sense, they border Poland and also the Kaliningrad enclave. The next one, if it now is a conventional war, then logically Russia may choose to expand further because it is strong enough. And once you get into a war, the prospect of holding back, of course, becomes ever less. If it expands, it will be into Poland. There are no other places. It is true it could go into Romania, and this was in fact Joseph Beck, who was previously the foreign minister in Poland's junta, which was the interwar government. And he thought that the Germans might well invade Russia from Romania. Unfortunately, this is not really true or possible. In a military sense, it's Poland which is the ideal ground for fighting. It's flat and it's directly on the route to Germany. It therefore follows that Poland will most likely be the its battleground, and this is in fact borne out by the fact that historically it's been a battleground for centuries, including the Great Northern War, World War I, and World War II. It therefore would follow that if the Russians are attacking, to stem their invasion, what the West might have to use are tactical nukes. Conversely, the Russians, in order to win the invasion, will consider using tactical nukes. Either way, it will be a further step in escalating the war, and one of the reasons why this may occur in Poland is because the Poles, whatever their pretensions, are not perceived as being part of the West by Western Europe and USA. They're seen as really being Zwischenland, as the Germans call it, in between countries. And Russia has had a rivalry with Poland for centuries, and either way, neither the West nor Russia will show any restraint or compunction in using nuclear weapons, local ones, which would be the theater weapons. One of the problems with using the theater weapons is you have to define what is theater, what is strategic. For the Americans, any war in Europe is a theater, whereas for the Europeans, it is exactly the same as strategic. Russia is, of course, connected with Europe, and such a war, including its radioactive fallout, may spread, leaving the Russians with the impression that even by tactical wars, they're going to be devastated. Therefore, they may choose to go the next stage up, which is strategic nuclear exchange. This has some advantages for them. They have excellent new developed missile systems, which some assert are better than the ones in the West. And the net effect of this would be that the Russians would be able perhaps to win the war. This would be a war-winning opportunity for them. Such are the complexities of trying to predict this, that obviously the exactly opposite, paradoxically, arrives at the same conclusion. To stop losing the war, Russia might use them, or vice versa, the West, for precisely the same reasons. By this time, the devastation occasioned by the nuclear exchange will, of course, be on a very substantial scale and not confined merely to Poland. Poland will merely be the first, And if the war, of course, stops after the theater nuclear war, country to be totally devastated by a nuclear conflict. So, what is important about this MAD is that every step down, so to speak, to war will seem small and justifiable. It will not be at any moment that there will not be logical, sound reasons for making a certain step. Just as sending troops to Ukraine is perfectly sound and reasonable, just as Russia doing maneuvers, and then more maneuvers will seem sound and reasonable and justifiable, as is justified every evening on television. Every action at a given phase will also be seen to be defensive and necessary. So whereas the West is portraying Russia as the aggressor, Russia sees the problem of the encroaching NATO as its problem and as an aggressive act. Therefore, militarily, to prevent the crisis from developing, to contain the conflict, and ultimately to win the war, there will be many steps taken, each step perfectly reasonable. The only problem being that the end result will be the thermonuclear exchange. What is clear is there will be no strategic nuking at the outset. It will not be the case that out of the blue will come the dreaded thermonuclear bombs to kill all. This was feared during the Cold War, which is why they developed the mutually assured destruction, so that the war could be stopped. There will be no immediate nuclear war, but rather could be contained, stopped at some point, which I assert would probably not be the case, but rather this is the route to war, because it is very hard to justify a thermonuclear nuking out of the blue. MAD, therefore, is going to be the route, ironically. So this is how this Ukrainian crisis could develop. However, it need not. There have been two other crises before, the poisoning and also the initial separatist movement and war in the Donetsk Basin. Neither led to World War III, so therefore neither need this one. This is at the stage of a mini-crisis, not a micro-crisis, but a mini-crisis in the sense that, yes, there are troops milling around at some points. Other times it appears more like a mega-crisis, as the troops could appear to be on the point of invading. What is clear is there need be no World War III. No World War III need occur from this crisis, whatever the newspapers say. Rather, it is a possibility to be borne in mind, and when this crisis goes away, which presumably one hopes will happen, and the newspapers and the media fall silent, actually the same threat remains, the same possibility of World War III, the same notion that a given crisis could develop from micro all the way to a mega, that they could then go military. So, it could be, in Ukraine again, another crisis. It could still be this one, which is by no means over at the time of giving this lecture. It could be in another place. The Kaliningrad enclave, for example, has already generated a micro-crisis when Russia did consider building a corridor all the way to the Kaliningrad enclave. One other aspect has to be stressed. World War III need not result in a nuclear winter, with the highest form of life left being a cockroach. After all, this is possible, and the human race has no right to survive in any sense. It's up to the people to find a way of moving forwards. This cockroach future is the one that was feared during the Cold War, but in point of fact, in my opinion, according to my analysis rather, there is another equally bad future. It's where humans are still left, but after billions have died, much property and land has been devastated. It is nuclear, it is radioactive, and the people left over don't have a very pleasant life, and progress as such will be halted. This sort of termination of the world, in the sense it'll become just a world hanging around going nowhere, is an entirely possible outcome of even a fairly limited thermonuclear exchange, because in fact the number of thermonuclear missiles is more than enough to destroy the world. So even a limit, but what I stress, even a limited exchange should be enough to terminate the world, even if it doesn't destroy it. There will, of course, be areas completely destroyed, such as Poland, but other areas may well, to some extent, survive. So the people of the survivalists, for example, in America, some of them may indeed actually survive a World War III. What is therefore clear is that we have a possible war. The problem is, if one could add just a final point, is to repeat the point that the president, Putin, is unfortunately being pushed by the West with its constant lecturing into a corner if we don't watch out. There could be no easy way out for him. Wars to prevent loss of face have occurred before, and this could happen this time. What is rather should be done is a more calm approach should be taken so that Putin still has a way of leaving the crisis without the loss of face, the constant loss of prestige, and quite possibly loss of life that occurs when somebody, especially a dictator, on the brink of war decides and is not to do so and is perceived to have failed in some way by the people. So, just to present myself again, Dr Marek Laskiewicz, Chairman and Deputy Rector of the Polana Uniwersytet Exteris, Pune, which was founded in July 2022, as a sister organization for the Polish University abroad in London, Pune. He is a member of the British International Studies Association, PISA, Political Studies Association, and the Royal Historical Association, as well as Secretary General of the Polish Society of Arts and Sciences Abroad, PTNO. Leader and founder of the Polish Association Great Britain, PWWB, and chairman of the Polish Social and Cultural Association, POSC. The lecture has been given here on Friday, 11th of February 2022 at 1800 hours GMT in the Celadon Room at POSC in London. Thank you for listening.